The conference room in the Russell Senate office building had that particular kind of silence that comes right before someone's entire world explodes. Not the comfortable silence of anticipation, but the thick, suffocating quiet that makes your ears ring and your stomach drop. The kind of silence where even breathing feels too loud. Ilhan Omar sat at the witness table, her posture perfect, her hijab immaculately arranged, her expression carefully composed into what her media training had taught her to call dignified defiance. 3 attorneys flanked her, their combined hourly rate probably exceeding what most Americans make in a month. They'd arrived early, claimed the best seats, arranged their materials with the kind of theatrical precision usually reserved for Broadway productions. This was supposed to be theater. Omar playing the victim, the committee going through the motions, everything wrapped up by lunch with maybe a slap on the wrist and a sternly worded letter that would be forgotten by next news cycle. That was the plan. The plan lasted exactly 47 seconds after Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana entered the room. He didn't stride in. He didn't make a grand entrance. He just sort of ambled, like a man who had all the time in the world and wasn't particularly worried about anything. He carried a battered leather briefcase that looked older than some of the staffers in the room, worn at the corners, the kind of thing a country lawyer might have carried to court for 30 years. His suit was rumpled in that way that suggested he'd either slept in it or simply didn't care about the opinions of people who noticed such things. His reading glasses hung from a chain around his neck, the kind your grandmother might wear. He looked, for all the world, like someone's kindly uncle who'd gotten lost on the way to the Cracker Barrel. That was his first weapon, that appearance. People consistently, reliably, fatally underestimated John Kennedy. He settled into his chair with a soft grunt, the leather creaking. He opened his briefcase, not hurrying, and began removing documents. Not a few documents, not a folder or two. Documents, stacks of them, binders, folders with colored tabs, everything meticulously organized, everything within easy reach. He arranged them on the desk in front of him with the care of a surgeon laying out instruments, each stack precisely positioned, each tab visible. Omar's lead attorney, a man named Silverstein who'd made his reputation defending white-collar criminals in Manhattan, watched this performance with growing unease. He'd done his research on Kennedy, Rhodes Scholar, University of Virginia Law, former Louisiana Supreme Court Justice. But the man looked like he should be discussing fishing tackle at the general store, not conducting a Senate investigation. Silverstein's first mistake was thinking the appearance mattered more than the preparation. Kennedy finished his arrangement, took a sip from a paper coffee cup that had seen better days, and looked up. His eyes, pale blue and absolutely calm, swept across the room, taking in every face, every expression, every tiny detail. Then those eyes settled on Ilhan Omar, and something in them, some quality of relentless, patient determination, made her sit up just a fraction straighter. "Ma'am," Kennedy said, his Louisiana drawl thick as honey and just as slow, "I appreciate you making time for us today. I know you're a busy person. Congress is demanding work. All those foreign policy meetings, campaign fundraisers, Twitter feuds to manage." He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time." Omar's practiced expression didn't waver. "Senator, I'm happy to answer any questions this committee might have." "Well, that's just wonderful," Kennedy said, pulling the first folder toward him. "Because I have questions. Lots of questions. The kind of questions that keep a man up at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how in the Sam Hill certain things are possible in the United States Congress." He opened the folder, and Omar caught a glimpse of what looked like bank statements, dozens of pages of them, each line highlighted in yellow marker. "But before we get into the complicated stuff," Kennedy continued, still with that easy conversational tone, "let's start with something simple, something even a simple country lawyer like myself can understand." He looked up at her, his expression open and curious, like he was genuinely puzzled. "Ma'am, how many times have you been married?" The question hung in the air, simple, direct, seemingly innocuous. Silverstein should have objected, should have said something about relevance, about personal matters, about the scope of the hearing. But the question was so simple, so straightforward that objecting would have looked defensive. So he sat there, and Omar answered, "My marital history is a matter of public record, Senator." "Indeed it is," Kennedy agreed pleasantly. "Indeed it is, which is why I'm confused." He pulled out a document, holding it up. "See, according to public records, you married Ahmed Abdizal Hiasi in 2002. Faith ceremony not legal. Then you separated. Then in 2009, you legally married Ahmed Said Elmi. Then you divorced him in 2017. Then you remarried Mr. Hiasi in 2018. Legal this time." He set down the paper and picked up another one. "Now, I've been married once. 38 years to the same woman who tells me that's 37 years too many, but we're still counting. So I don't have much experience with multiple marriages. But this timeline, ma'am, this timeline raises some questions." Omar's expression remained neutral. "What questions would those be, Senator?" Kennedy's smile widened just a fraction. "Well, let's start with Mr. Elmi, Ahmed Said Elmi, your second husband, or technically your first legal husband. The paperwork gets confusing." He pulled out a thick folder, this one with red tabs. "Mr. Elmi entered the United States in 2009 on a student visa. 3 weeks later, you married him. Now, ma'am, I consider myself a romantic. My wife says I'm about as romantic as a fence post, but I try. Still, 3 weeks seems awfully fast to go from hello to I do, doesn't it? People marry on different timelines, Senator." "They surely do," Kennedy agreed. "They surely do, but here's what puzzles me." He opened the folder, pulling out several documents. "These are property records, tax records, school enrollment forms, and they tell an interesting story." He spread them across his section of the witness table, each document positioned where the cameras could catch them. "According to these records, during your marriage to Mr. Elmi, from 2009 to 2017, you lived at 2629 11th Avenue South in Minneapolis. Nice neighborhood, I'm told. Meanwhile, Mr. Elmi, your legal husband, lived at 3148 Cedar Avenue. Different neighborhood, different zip code, not even close to each other." Omar's jaw tightened, barely perceptible, but Kennedy saw it. "Now, ma'am, I'm old-fashioned. When I got married, my wife and I figured we should probably live in the same house. Cuts down on the commute, makes dinner conversations easier, that sort of thing. But you and Mr. Elmi, you maintained separate residences for 8 years of marriage." He paused, letting that sink in. 8 years. Not a trial separation. Not a work-related temporary situation. 8 full years of living in different houses while legally married. Silverstein finally spoke up. "Senator, how Representative Omar chose to structure her living arrangements is hardly relevant to—" "Oh, but it is relevant," Kennedy interrupted, his voice still pleasant but now with an edge of steel underneath. "It's relevant because of these." He pulled out another set of documents. "Immigration forms, filed by Mr. Elmi, adjustment of status applications, work authorization applications. Every single one of them lists his marital status as married, spouse Ilhan Omar, and that marriage is the basis for his immigration benefits." He looked up at Omar, his pale eyes sharp now, all the folksy charm stripped away for just a moment. "You don't get to claim marriage benefits for immigration purposes while living separately for 8 years, ma'am. That's not how it works. That's not a marriage. That's fraud." The room went very still. "Those are serious allegations," Silverstein said, his voice tight. "They're not allegations," Kennedy replied calmly. "They're questions based on public records, your client's public records, her signatures on public documents. If they're allegations, she's the one who made them against herself." He pulled out yet another folder, this one blue-tabbed. "But it gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. During this same period, 2009 to 2017, while you were legally married to Mr. Elmi and living at separate addresses, these are your federal tax returns." He held them up, thick stacks of paper. "Ma'am, you filed joint tax returns with Ahmed Hiasi. Not Ahmed Elmi, your legal husband. Ahmed Hiasi, the man you had a faith ceremony with but weren't legally married to." The silence in the room was absolute. Kennedy set down the tax returns with exaggerated care. "Now, I'm going to speak real slow here because I want to make sure everyone understands the implications of what I just said. During the years 2014 and 2015, Representative Omar filed joint federal tax returns with Ahmed Hiasi, claiming the tax benefits of being married. Except she wasn't married to Ahmed Hiasi. She was married to Ahmed Elmi. You can't file joint returns with someone you're not married to. That's not complicated tax law. That's just fraud. Omar's face had gone pale. Silverstein was writing furiously on a legal pad. But wait, Kennedy said, his drawl returning, that folksy persona sliding back into place like a comfortable jacket. It gets even more interesting. These are your federal student loan applications. Another folder, this one green-tabbed. From 2009 through 2012, you applied for federal financial aid, and on every single application you checked the box for single. Not married. Single. He looked up. Except you weren't single. You were married to Mr. Elmi. Now, why would someone lie about being single on a federal loan application? Well, because married couples' assets are combined for financial aid purposes. Single people get more aid, so you lied to get more money. That's federal loan fraud, ma'am. Omar's attorney stood. Senator Kennedy, I must object to this line of questioning. You're making accusations without. I'm not making accusations, Kennedy said, his voice sharp now, the steel showing through. I'm reading your client's own documents. Documents she signed. Documents she swore were true under penalty of perjury. If you have an objection to the facts, take it up with the facts. He pulled out his largest folder yet, this one easily 2 inches thick. But we're just getting started. See, I've been doing some math, trying to make sense of these contradictions, and I keep coming back to the same questions. Kennedy stood now, walking around his desk, approaching the witness table. Not threateningly, just conversationally, like a professor giving a lecture. From 2009 to 2017, you signed federal immigration forms swearing you were married to Ahmed Elmi. You signed federal tax forms swearing you were married to Ahmed Hiasi. You signed federal loan applications swearing you were single. You signed lease applications listing different primary residences. Every single one of these documents has the same words at the bottom. I declare under penalty of perjury that the above statements are true and correct. He stopped, looking directly at Omar. Ma'am, they can't all be true. If you were married to Elmi, the tax returns are false. If you were married to Hiasi, the immigration forms are false. If you were single, everything is false. But all of these documents have your signature on them, your signature declaring them true. The weight of what he was saying settled over the room like a physical presence. So here's my question, and I want you to think real carefully before you answer. Kennedy's voice was quiet now, almost gentle. Which documents did you lie on? Because, ma'am, perjury is a crime. Each false statement is a separate crime, and I'm counting at least 15 separate signed documents that contradict each other. 15 separate potential perjury charges. Omar sat frozen, her carefully constructed composure cracking. Silverstein was whispering urgently in her ear, but she seemed unable to respond. Kennedy walked back to his desk, that slow amble unthreatening. He sat down, took a sip of his coffee, and pulled out yet another folder. But we're not done yet. Not even close. Because all of that, the marriages, the taxes, the loans, that's just the foundation. Now we get to talk about money. Campaign money. And ma'am, that's where things get really interesting. He opened the new folder with a small smile, that dangerous, patient smile. Let's talk about Tim Minot. If Omar had looked uncomfortable before, she now looked genuinely worried. The name hung in the air, heavy with implication. Kennedy pulled out a poster board, setting it up on an easel. It was a timeline, professionally made, with photos, dates, and dollar amounts in bold red numbers. Tim Minot, political consultant, runs a firm called the E Street Group, and according to Federal Election Commission records, your campaign has paid his firm quite a lot of money. He pointed to the first entry on the timeline. March 2018, first payment to E Street Group, $12,000, reasonable enough. April 2018, another payment. May, June, payments keep coming. Standard stuff for a congressional campaign. His finger traced up the timeline. But then something interesting happens. June 2018, you and Mr. Minot are photographed together at a political event in Los Angeles. Both of you married to other people at the time. And after that, these payments, they start getting ambitious. The timeline showed a dramatic increase in payment amounts, the red numbers growing larger and larger. August 2018, $21,000 for travel consultation. September through December, $143,000 total. Then January 2019 hits and ma'am, you really opened the checkbook. January alone, $78,000. February, $92,000. March, $113,000. Kennedy turned from the timeline to face Omar directly. By March 2019, you'd paid Tim Minett's firm over $200,000 in just 3 months. Now, I did some research. I called around to campaign consultants, asked about typical rates. Most house campaigns in Minnesota spend about $180,000 on consulting for an entire cycle. You paid that much to one firm in 3 months. He walked back to the timeline, tapping a photo. April 2019. You and Mr. Minett are photographed together in Hawaii. Interesting vacation spot for a consultant and his client. May 2019, you both file for divorce from your respective spouses. June 2019, you're photographed holding hands in public, no longer hiding the relationship. His finger moved to July 2019, where the largest red number on the timeline glared, $214,000. July 2019, 1 month. You paid Tim Minett's firm $214,000 in a single month. Ma'am, presidential campaigns don't pay consultants that much in a month. Senate races don't pay that much. But your house campaign, in a safe district where you were running essentially unopposed, paid $214,000 to your boyfriend's consulting firm in 30 days. Kennedy let that number hang in the air, watching it sink in. Let me put that in perspective for folks watching at home. The median household income in America is about $68,000 a year. You paid your boyfriend more in 1 month than most American families make in 3 years. For what exactly? Omar's voice was tight when she answered. Mr. Minett's firm provided comprehensive strategic services to my campaign. Comprehensive, Kennedy repeated, savoring the word. Comprehensive. Well, let's look at what those comprehensive services included. He pulled out a stack of invoices, each one highlighted and tabbed. August 2019, $26,000 for travel consultation related to a trip to Ghana. Ma'am, I can book a first-class trip to Ghana for 2 people, 5-star hotels, personal driver, the whole 9 yards for under $10,000. What did you do with the other $16,000? He didn't wait for an answer. September 2019, $31,000 for digital strategy consultation. Your Twitter account, which is where you do most of your communication, is free. October 2019, $42,000 for messaging analysis. What messages? What analysis? Show me the reports. Show me the deliverables. Show me what taxpayer money, funneled through donor contributions, actually paid for. Kennedy walked to a chart on another poster board, this one showing payment comparisons. I had my staff do a comprehensive analysis. We looked at every house campaign in similar districts. Safe seats, urban districts, incumbents. This is what they paid for political consulting. The chart showed a series of bars, most hovering between $150,000 and $300,000 for entire election cycles. Then, towering above them all, one bar in red, $2.7 million. That's you, ma'am. $2.7 million to one consulting firm over 2 years. 15 times the average for comparable campaigns. And it all went to the firm run by the man you were sleeping with. The room erupted in murmurs. Omar's face was flushed, her hands gripping the table. Now, let me be clear about what the law says, Kennedy continued, his voice cutting through the noise. You can pay consultants. You can pay them well. You can pay the market rate for services rendered. But you cannot use campaign funds to pay for personal expenses. You cannot use donor money to fund your love life. And ma'am, when you're paying rates 15 times higher than market value to your romantic partner, that starts to look an awful lot like converting campaign funds for personal use. He pulled out the Federal Election Campaign Act, the actual statute, and read from it. Section 52, USC 30,114. A contribution or donation shall not be converted by any person to personal use. The penalty for knowing and willful violation is up to $250,000 in fines and 5 years in prison per violation. Kennedy set down the statute and picked up a calculator. I count 73 separate reportable payments to Mr. Minot's firm. Even if we're conservative and say only half of those were excessive or improperly used, that's still 36 separate violations. 36 times 5 years is 180 years in prison, ma'am. Now, they'd run concurrently, of course. You wouldn't actually serve 180 years. But even a fraction of that is enough to make you think twice about whether those Hawaiian vacations were worth it. Omar's attorney stood again. Senator, you're engaging in wild speculation about the nature of— I'm reading FEC reports, Kennedy interrupted. Public reports, filed by your client, signed by your client. The speculation isn't about whether these payments happened. They happened. The speculation is about whether they were legitimate campaign expenses or personal expenses disguised as campaign expenses. And sir, when someone is paying their boyfriend's firm 15 times market rate, I don't think I'm speculating very wildly to suggest something improper was going on. Kennedy sat back down, pulling out another folder. But let's talk about timing, because timing is everything in fraud cases. He pulled out a detailed timeline, this one showing the progression of Omar's relationship with Minot alongside the campaign payments. March 2018, first payment. June 2018, first public appearance together. August 2018, payments increase significantly. December 2018, both parties' spouses report marital problems. March 2019, payments exceed $100,000 per month. April 2019, caught together in Hawaii. May 2019, both file for divorce. July 2019, highest payment month ever. August 2019, publicly dating. October 2019, payments continue at elevated levels. He looked up. That's not a consulting relationship that happened to turn romantic. That's a romantic relationship being funded by campaign money. There's a word for that, ma'am. Several words, actually. Fraud, embezzlement, conversion of campaign funds. Pick your favorite. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice dropping. You took money that donors gave you to represent them in Congress, and you used it to pay your boyfriend. Whether you called it consulting or digital strategy or messaging analysis or any other fancy term, you took money meant for one purpose and used it for another. That's theft. And when you file FEC reports claiming those were legitimate campaign expenses when they were actually payments to your romantic partner, that's fraud on top of theft. The devastation was complete. Omar sat at the table, her attorneys huddled around her, whispering frantically. But Kennedy wasn't done. He was just getting warmed up. Now, he said, pulling out his next folder with the care of a surgeon selecting his next instrument, let's talk about foreign policy. Because that's where things get really concerning. If you're still watching, hit that subscribe button because what comes next is going to blow your mind. Kennedy stood, stretching slightly, the leather of his chair creaking. He picked up a different folder, this one marked with yellow tabs, each tab labeled with a country name. Turkey, Qatar, Iran. He set it down on the desk with a soft thud. Ma'am, when you took the oath of office, you swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Do you remember taking that oath? Omar's voice was steady but tired. Of course I do. Good, Kennedy said. Because I want to talk about how you've honored that oath. Specifically, I want to talk about your voting record, your meetings with foreign officials, and your rather curious pattern of always, and I mean always, voting against American interests when those interests conflict with certain foreign powers. He opened the folder and pulled out a thick document. This is your complete voting record on foreign policy matters since you took office. My staff spent 3 weeks analyzing it, comparing it to your colleagues, looking for patterns. And ma'am, we found patterns, disturbing patterns. Kennedy walked to yet another poster board, this one showing a map of the Middle East with certain countries highlighted in red. Let's start with Turkey. Beautiful country, rich history, currently run by an authoritarian who's been systematically dismantling democratic institutions. President Erdogan. You familiar with him? I'm aware of President Erdogan, yes. I bet you are, Kennedy said. In fact, according to these visitor logs, you're very aware of him. Between 2017 and 2020, you met with Turkish government officials, either here or in Turkey, 17 times. 17. You met with Turkish officials more than you met with Minnesota agricultural groups, and ma'am, you represent a district that includes farming communities. He pulled out photos, grainy but clear enough, showing Omar at various events with men in suits, some photos with identifying text at the bottom. Here's you in March 2017, meeting with Turkish Foreign Ministry officials in Doha. Here's you in April 2017, at a conference in Washington with Turkish diplomatic staff. May 2017, June 2017, the meetings keep coming. Kennedy turned from the poster to face her directly. Now, meetings with foreign officials aren't illegal. They're part of the job, but you didn't disclose most of these meetings on your financial disclosure forms. Why not? Omar shifted in her seat. Some meetings were informal and didn't meet the threshold for disclosure. Didn't meet the threshold, Kennedy repeated. Ma'am, you sat down with representatives of a foreign government 17 times, and it didn't meet the threshold. Let me read you the House Ethics Rules. He pulled out another document. Members must disclose all contacts with foreign government officials when those contacts relate to official duties or when anything of value is discussed or received. Every single one of these meetings related to your official duties. You were a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Every meeting with foreign officials relates to your official duties. He set down the rules and picked up a voting record. But let's talk about what you did after these meetings. Let's look at your votes on Turkey-related legislation. Kennedy read from the record. February 2019. Resolution calling for Turkey to respect human rights. You voted no. April 2019. Bill sanctioning Turkey for purchasing Russian missile systems. You voted no. October 2019. Resolution condemning Turkey's invasion of northern Syria and its attacks on our Kurdish allies. You voted no. December 2019. Bill blocking military sales to Turkey. You voted no. He looked up, sensing a pattern. Every single time Congress tried to hold Turkey accountable for anything, you voted to protect Turkey. Now that's your right. You can vote however you want. But when you're meeting secretly with Turkish officials and then consistently voting in favor of Turkish interests, that starts to look like something other than independent policy judgment. Kennedy pulled out email printouts, dozens of pages. These emails were provided to this committee by a whistleblower. They show correspondence between your staff and individuals connected to Turkish lobbying efforts. Let me read you one from September 2019. He found the page he wanted. Congresswoman Omar's position on the Syria situation aligns perfectly with President Erdogan's regional security concerns. We appreciate her willingness to consider alternative perspectives. He set down the email. Alternative perspectives. That's a nice way of saying Turkish propaganda. Your staff was coordinating with Turkish influence operations to align your public statements with Erdogan's foreign policy goals. Not American foreign policy goals. Turkish foreign policy goals. Omar's attorney started to object, but Kennedy rolled over him. Let me save you the breath. Yes, these emails are real. Yes, they were obtained legally through Congressional Oversight Authority. Yes, they show exactly what I said they show. He pulled out another section of documents. But Turkey isn't the only country you seem to prioritize over American interests. Let's talk about Qatar. The room seemed to lean in collectively. Qatar was a sensitive subject, a small nation with vast wealth and complicated relationships across the Middle East. Kennedy pulled out more visitor logs. March 2017, you traveled to Doha, Qatar. You met with Qatari government officials. You didn't disclose this trip on your financial disclosure forms. April 2017, another meeting with Qatari representatives. June 2017, September 2017, November 2017. 6 meetings in your first year in office, all somehow forgotten when it came time to fill out disclosure forms. He pulled out a chart showing Qatar's lobbying expenditures in the United States. Qatar spends more money on lobbying in America than almost any other foreign nation. Tens of millions of dollars a year, trying to influence U.S. policy. And isn't it interesting how your positions on Qatar perfectly mirror Qatar's lobbying priorities? Kennedy read from another voting record. February 2019. Bill increasing scrutiny on Qatari financing of Hamas and other terrorist groups. You voted no. June 2019. Resolution condemning Qatar's human rights violations. You voted no. September 2019. Legislation sanctioning Qatar for supporting terrorist organizations. You voted no. You were the only Democrat to vote no, ma'am. The only one. He set down the papers and walked closer to the witness table. So let's review. You meet secretly with Turkish officials, then vote in Turkey's interests. You meet secretly with Qatari officials, then vote in Qatar's interests. You accept campaign donations from individuals with documented ties to Turkish and Qatari influence networks, then vote against American legislation that would harm Turkish and Qatari interests. Kennedy pulled out a financial analysis. These are donor records. Your campaign received $432,000 in donations from individuals with documented connections to Turkish and Qatari influence operations. Now, individually, each donation is under the legal limit, but collectively, when you have dozens of people with ties to the same foreign governments all donating to the same candidate, that's called a conduit scheme. You know what the FBI calls it? Conspiracy to violate federal election law. Omar's face had gone from pale to flushed. Her attorneys were writing frantically, trying to keep up with the avalanche of evidence. But let me tell you what really concerns me, Kennedy said, his voice dropping to something quieter, more serious. It's not just that you vote against American interests. Lots of members disagree about what American interests are. That's democracy. What concerns me is that you vote against American interests so consistently, so reliably, when those interests conflict with Turkey and Qatar. And you do it after meeting with their officials and receiving money from their influence networks. He pulled out a comparison chart. I had my staff analyze the voting records of other members from similar districts, urban districts with significant Muslim populations, members who might be sympathetic to Muslim-majority countries. This is Representative Tlaib from Michigan. On Turkey-related votes, she aligns with stated U.S. policy interests 73% of the time. This is Representative Carson from Indiana, 81% alignment. This is Representative Ellison, your predecessor in your own district, 88% alignment. Kennedy looked up. You, ma'am, 17% alignment. You vote against American interests on Turkey and Qatar issues 83% of the time. You're not just an outlier. You're an extreme outlier. Your voting pattern is so far outside the norm that it raises serious questions about what's motivating your votes. He walked back to his desk and pulled out a thick legal document. This is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA. It requires people who lobby for foreign governments to register with the Department of Justice. The penalties for violating FARA are serious. Up to 5 years in prison, up to $250,000 in fines. Kennedy looked directly at Omar. Ma'am, I can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt, sitting here today, that you're an unregistered foreign agent. But I can say that your pattern of behavior, meeting secretly with foreign officials, receiving money from foreign influence networks, and consistently voting in those foreign nations' interests, looks an awful lot like what FARA is designed to prevent. He paused, letting that accusation sit. And if you are acting as a foreign agent, even informally, even without explicit coordination, that's not just a violation of federal law. That's a betrayal of your oath of office. That's betrayal of the people who elected you. That's betrayal of America. The room was deadly silent. Omar sat motionless, her carefully constructed defense crumbling piece by piece. Kennedy pulled out one more document, this one clearly old, yellowed at the edges. This is correspondence from the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, dated March 2019. It's a letter to you asking for clarification on your meetings with foreign officials. You never responded. The committee sent a second letter in June 2019. No response. A third letter in September 2019. Still no response. He looked at Omar. 3 formal requests from a congressional committee asking you to explain your foreign contacts, and you ignored all of them. Why? If these meetings were innocent, if your votes were based on principle rather than foreign influence, why not just explain that? Why hide? Why refuse to cooperate? Why delete meeting records from your calendar? Why forget to disclose 6 trips and 17 meetings on your financial forms? Kennedy's voice rose slightly. I'll tell you why. Because you knew those meetings would raise questions. You knew those votes would look suspicious. You knew that if Americans saw the full picture, saw the meetings and the money and the votes all together, they would reach the same conclusion I've reached. You're not representing Minnesota's 5th District, you're representing Ankara and Doha. He sat down heavily. And that, ma'am, is a betrayal that goes beyond law and politics. That's a betrayal of everything this institution is supposed to represent. But Kennedy wasn't finished. He pulled out another folder, this one noticeably thicker than the others, and the expression on his face changed. The prosecutorial edge was still there, but now there was something else. Disgust. Real, visceral disgust. Now we need to talk about something else, he said quietly. We need to talk about anti-Semitism. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. This was different territory, more personal, more inflammatory. Omar sat up straighter, her jaw set. Kennedy pulled out a printed tweet blown up to poster size. February 10, 2019. You tweeted, and I'm reading your exact words. It's all about the Benjamin's baby. He held up the poster. This was in response to a discussion about U.S.-Israel relations. When called out by members of your own party, Democrats, Jewish Democrats, you initially dismissed the concerns. Only after significant pressure did you issue an apology. He set down the poster and pulled out another. But this wasn't your first time. November 16, 2012, before you were in Congress, you tweeted, Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. Kennedy's voice was flat, controlled. Hypnotize the world. Ma'am, do you know what that phrase evokes? It invokes one of the oldest, most dangerous anti-Semitic tropes in history. The idea that Jews secretly control world events. The idea that Jews manipulate governments and media. It's straight out of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of the most destructive pieces of anti-Semitic propaganda ever created. Omar started to speak, but Kennedy held up his hand. I know what you're going to say. You were criticizing the Israeli government, not Jewish people. But ma'am, when you use language about hypnosis and world control, you're not criticizing a government's policies. You're invoking conspiracy theories that have gotten Jewish people killed for centuries. He pulled out a report. This is from the Anti-Defamation League. It documents the use of classical anti-Semitic tropes in modern political discourse. Your tweets are cited 17 times in this report. 17. You're used as a case study for how not to discuss Israeli government policy without slipping into anti-Semitism. Kennedy pulled out testimony from a Minneapolis rabbi. This is from Rabbi Michael Adam Latz. He leads a synagogue in your district. After your Benjamin's tweet gained national attention, his synagogue received 23 threats in 2 weeks. Before your tweet, they averaged 1 threat per year. After your tweet, 23 in 14 days. He looked up. That's cause and effect, ma'am. When someone with a national platform invokes age-old hatreds, people listen, and some of those people act on what they hear. You made it acceptable to talk about Jewish money controlling politics, and Jewish communities paid the price in threats and fear. Omar's voice was tight. I have been clear that I oppose anti-Semitism in all forms. Have you? Kennedy's response was sharp. Because I have a list here of 7 occasions where you were asked to condemn specific anti-Semitic attacks, and every single time you added a but. I condemn anti-Semitism, but we must also address Islamophobia. Ma'am, when Jewish children are being attacked in the streets of New York because rhetoric like yours has normalized anti-Jewish hatred, but isn't an appropriate response. He pulled out crime statistics. This is data from the NYPD. Hate crimes against Jewish people in New York City. 2018, before you took office, 153 incidents. 2019, your first year in Congress, 274 incidents. 2020, 336 incidents. Now, I'm not saying you directly caused every one of those attacks, but when you normalize anti-Semitic tropes, when you make it acceptable to suggest that support for Israel is all about the Benjamins, you create an atmosphere where hatred flourishes. Kennedy pulled out a letter, clearly well-worn from being handled. This is a letter signed by 87 rabbis from across the political spectrum: Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist. They represent hundreds of thousands of Jewish Americans. They wrote to you in 2019, asking for a meeting to discuss your rhetoric and its impact on their communities. He looked up at Omar. You never responded. 87 religious leaders, representing hundreds of thousands of your fellow citizens, and you couldn't find time in your schedule to meet with them. But you had time for 17 meetings with Turkish officials. You had time to meet with Qatari government representatives. But American rabbis asking you to understand how your words were hurting their communities. No time. Omar's face was red now. You're taking my legitimate criticism of Israeli government policy and twisting it into... I'm not twisting anything, Kennedy interrupted. I'm reading your words. When you say Israel has hypnotized the world, those are your words. When you suggest that American support for Israel is all about the Benjamins, all about Jewish money, those are your words. When you compare Israel to the Taliban, those are your words. You can't hide behind "I was just criticizing policy" when the words you choose come straight from anti-Semitic propaganda. He pulled out one final document. This is your voting record on Israel-related legislation. Funding for Iron Dome, a purely defensive missile system designed to protect civilians from rocket attacks. You voted no. Resolution condemning Hamas terrorism. You voted present. Legislation supporting Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations. You voted no. Funding for the U.S.-Israel Strategic Partnership. You voted no. Kennedy set down the paper. You don't just criticize Israeli policy, ma'am. You vote against every piece of legislation that supports Israel in any way, even defensive measures to protect civilians, even peace initiatives, even strategic partnerships between America and its closest Middle Eastern ally. That's not policy disagreement. That's hostility. He leaned forward. And when that hostility is expressed using anti-Semitic tropes about hypnosis and money, when it's combined with a refusal to meet with concerned Jewish leaders, when it results in increased threats against Jewish communities, it crosses a line from political disagreement into something much more dangerous. The room was silent, but Kennedy had one more subject to cover, one more devastating revelation, and this one was going to hit differently than all the others. Comment below if you think politicians should be held accountable, because what comes next shows exactly why accountability matters. Kennedy took a long drink of water. When he set down the glass, his expression had changed again. The prosecutorial edge was still there, but now there was something deeper, something that looked like genuine pain. Ma'am, I want to talk about September 11th, 2001. Do you remember that day? The question seemed to come out of nowhere, a shift in subject so abrupt that Omar visibly startled. Of course I remember, she said carefully. Good, Kennedy said softly, because I remember it too. I was in court that morning. Someone ran in, told us a plane had hit the World Trade Center. We all thought it was a terrible accident. Then the second plane hit. Then the Pentagon. Then a field in Pennsylvania where heroes died stopping another attack. He paused, and for the first time his voice carried real emotion. I remember thinking the world had changed. And it had. Nearly 3,000 Americans murdered in a single morning. First responders running into burning buildings. People jumping from windows because burning alive was worse. A nation in shock and grief and rage. Kennedy pulled out a transcript of a speech. So I was very interested when I read your speech at the Council on American-Islamic Relations in March 2019. You were talking about CAIR's founding. And you said, and I quote your exact words, CAIR was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. He set down the transcript. The silence in the room was absolute. Some people did something. Kennedy repeated the words slowly, letting each one hang in the air. That's how you described September 11th. Some people did something. Like it was a parking ticket. Like it was cutting in line at Starbucks. like it was some minor inconvenience rather than the worst terrorist attack in American history. Omar started to speak. Kennedy held up his hand. Let me finish. See, I got curious after I heard that. I wondered if maybe you just spoke casually about tragedies in general. So I looked at other statements you've made about terrorist attacks. He pulled out more documents. Here's your statement on the Christchurch mosque shooting in New Zealand. Terrorism rooted in white supremacy massacred 50 innocent Muslims. Specific, clear, accurate. You named the ideology, you named the crime, you called it terrorism. He pulled out another. Here's your statement on the El Paso shooting. White nationalist terrorism killed 23 people in a racist attack. Again, specific perpetrators, specific crime. He looked up. But September 11th, some people did something. Not al-Qaeda terrorists murdered nearly 3,000 Americans. Not radical Islamic extremists hijacked planes and committed mass murder. Not terrorists chose evil and killed thousands of innocent people. Just some people did something. Kennedy's voice was getting quieter, which somehow made it more intense. Ma'am, why can you name white supremacist terrorism but you can't name Islamic terrorism? Why can you call the Christchurch attack a massacre but September 11th is just something that happened? Why can you be specific and accurate about crimes committed by white people, but vague and minimizing about crimes committed in the name of Islam? He pulled out testimonies, letters from 9/11 families. This is a letter from the widow of a firefighter who died in the North Tower. She wrote to this committee. I'm going to read what she said because I think it matters. Kennedy's voice was rough now. I have spent 18 years trying to explain to my children how their father died. I've struggled with words like terrorist and murder and evil. I've tried to help them understand that their daddy ran toward danger to save people he didn't even know. But now, a member of Congress has given me new language. Some people did something. Should I tell my children that some people did something to their daddy? That something happened and now he's gone. Is that how we honor the people who died? Is that how we remember the worst day in our nation's history? The letter trembled slightly in Kennedy's hand. She ends by asking, does Representative Omar think my husband's death was just something that happened? Kennedy set down the letter carefully. That's what I want to know too, ma'am. Do you think September 11th was just something that happened? Because your words suggest you do. Your minimization of that day, your refusal to name the ideology that motivated those attacks, your vague, dismissive language, all of it suggests that you don't view September 11th the way most Americans view it. He pulled out another document. And here's something else interesting. You made this statement at CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations. You said CAIR was founded after 9/11, except CAIR was founded in 1994, 7 years before September 11th. So not only did you minimize the worst terrorist attack in American history, you did it while lying about an organization that, according to federal prosecutors in multiple cases, has connections to Hamas and other terrorist organizations. Omar's attorney finally managed to interject. Senator, you're mischaracterizing. I'm reading her words, Kennedy said flatly, verbatim from a recorded speech. There's no mischaracterization. She said some people did something, those are her words. She said CAIR was founded after 9/11. That's false. Those are facts. He turned back to Omar. After this speech caused outrage, did you meet with 9/11 families? No. Did you meet with first responders? No. Did you issue a clear, unambiguous apology? No. You released a statement saying you were being taken out of context. Kennedy's voice rose slightly. Ma'am, there is no context that makes some people did something an appropriate way to describe mass murder. There is no context where that's acceptable. None. He pulled out one final document. This is a resolution that was introduced in the House after your statement. It doesn't mention you by name, though everyone knew it was about you. It condemns the minimization of terrorism, particularly the September 11th attacks. Want to know how you voted? He didn't wait for an answer. You voted present. Not yes, not no. Present. You couldn't even bring yourself to vote yes on a resolution condemning the minimization of September 11th after you minimized September 11th. Kennedy set down all his papers and looked directly at Omar. 19 terrorists, not some people. 19 al-Qaeda terrorists with names and faces and a specific evil ideology murdered 2,977 Americans. Those weren't just some people. They were monsters who chose mass murder. And that wasn't just something. That was terrorism. That was evil. That was the deliberate, planned, executed killing of thousands of innocent people. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The fact that you can't say that clearly, that you can't name Islamic terrorism when it's Islamic terrorists we're talking about, tells me everything about where your sympathies lie. And those sympathies don't seem to be with the Americans who died that day, or the Americans who lost loved ones, or the Americans who ran toward danger to save others. The devastation was complete. Omar sat rigid in her chair, her face ashen. Her attorneys had stopped taking notes. The gallery was silent except for someone quietly weeping. And then Kennedy pulled out a new folder. And when he spoke again, his voice had shifted into pure prosecutorial mode. Now, he said, let's talk about perjury. Share this video. People need to understand what happened in this room. Kennedy spread documents across his desk in a pattern that looked almost like a poker hand being revealed. Tax forms, immigration papers, loan applications, marriage certificates, each one flagged with colored tabs, each one marked with highlights and annotations. Ma'am, we've covered a lot of ground today. Marriage fraud, campaign finance violations, foreign agent concerns, anti-Semitism, minimizing terrorism. That's quite a list. But all of those things, as serious as they involve interpretation. They involve intent. They require proving what you were thinking when you did certain things. He picked up one set of documents. But perjury is simple. You signed a document, you swore the information on that document was true, and the information was false. That's it. No interpretation needed. No questions about intent. You lied under oath. Period. Kennedy held up a federal tax return. This is your joint tax return for 2014. You signed it. Right here, your signature. And right above your signature, it says, under penalties of perjury, I declare that I have examined this return and accompanying schedules and statements, and to the best of my knowledge and belief, they are true, correct, and complete. He set it down and picked up another. This is your joint tax return for 2015. Same language, same signature. You declared under penalty of perjury that these returns were true and correct. Kennedy picked up a marriage certificate. This is your marriage certificate to Ahmed Nur-Said Elmi, dated February 2009. You were legally married to this man from 2009 to 2017. That's not in dispute. It's public record. He looked up at Omar. So here's the problem. These tax returns list your spouse as Ahmed Abdizalin Hiasi, not Ahmed Elmi, Hiasi. You filed joint tax returns with a man you were not legally married to while being legally married to a completely different man. Kennedy let that sink in. That's not complicated tax law. That's not a gray area. That's fraud. You can't file joint returns with someone you're not married to, and you definitely can't do it while you're legally married to someone else. Each false tax return is a separate count of perjury. 2 years, 2 counts. He pulled out student loan applications. These are your federal financial aid applications from 2009, 2010, 2011, and 2012. On every single one, you checked the box for single, not married, single. Kennedy held them up one by one. But you weren't single. You were married to Ahmed Elmi during this entire period. So why did you lie? Because married couples' assets are combined for financial aid calculations. Single people get more aid. You lied to fraudulently obtain federal student loans. He set them down. Each false application is perjury. Each one has the same language. I certify that all information reported is complete and correct. 4 applications, 4 counts of perjury, plus federal student loan fraud. Kennedy pulled out immigration forms. These are I-130 forms, petition for alien relative. Ahmed Elmi filed these as part of his immigration process. They list you as his spouse. They list your address as his address. They claim you live together as a married couple. He pulled out lease applications. But these apartment lease applications tell a different story. You listed 2629 11th Avenue South as your primary residence. Elmi listed 3148 Cedar Avenue as his address. Different addresses, different neighborhoods. You signed these leases under penalty of perjury claiming those were your primary residences. Kennedy spread all the documents out. So which is it? Did you live with Elmi, making the immigration forms true but the lease applications false? Or did you live separately, making the lease applications true but the immigration forms false? Either way, you lied under oath on federal documents. He pulled out voter registration forms. Then there are these. Your voter registration from 2010 through 2017. Every single year, you listed your address as 2629 11th Avenue South. But school enrollment records for your children list their address as 3148 Cedar Avenue, Elmi's address. Your children lived with Elmi while you claimed to live somewhere else. Kennedy looked up. I count 15 separate federal documents with your signature where you swore under penalty of perjury that the information was true. Tax returns, loan applications, immigration forms, lease applications, voter registrations. 15 documents. And they can't all be true because they directly contradict each other. He picked up the Federal Criminal Code. Title 18, Section 1621, Perjury. Whoever, having taken an oath before a competent tribunal, officer, or person, that he will testify truly, willfully and contrary to such oath states or subscribes any material matter which he does not believe to be true, is guilty of perjury and shall be fined or imprisoned not more than 5 years or both. Kennedy set down the code. 5 years per count, 15 counts. That's 75 years maximum. Obviously, sentences would run concurrently, not consecutively. But even concurrent, you're looking at 5 years in federal prison. That's if we only charge the perjury. When we add immigration fraud, that's another 5 to 10 years. Tax fraud adds 3 years per return. Student loan fraud adds 5 years per application. He pulled out a sentencing guidelines manual, opening to a marked page. The federal sentencing guidelines assign a base offense level to each crime. Perjury is level 12. Immigration fraud is level 10. Tax fraud is level 10. Student loan fraud is level 8. When you commit multiple related crimes, the offense levels stack. Kennedy did the math on a notepad. With all the enhancements for multiple counts and related conduct, you're looking at an offense level around 18 to 20. At level 18, the sentencing range is 27 to 33 months. At level 20, it's 33 to 41 months. That's 3 years minimum in federal prison, and that's if you have no criminal history and get the most favorable calculations. He looked up, but here's what really concerns me. The statute of limitations for perjury is 5 years. Normally, that's 5 years from when the perjury was committed, but there's an exception. If the government doesn't discover the perjury within that time, the clock starts when they discover it. Kennedy smiled, that small, dangerous smile. This committee, this investigation, discovering these contradictory documents today, that starts the clock, ma'am. Everything you thought was safely in the past, everything you thought you'd gotten away with, just became actively prosecutable again. Omar's lead attorney was frantically writing notes, trying to keep up, trying to find some angle of defense. But Kennedy had built a case with her own documents, her own signatures, her own sworn statements. There was no wiggle room. So here's my question, Kennedy said, his voice almost conversational now. Which documents do you want to admit you lied on? The tax returns, the loan applications, the immigration forms, the lease applications. Because they can't all be true, you have to pick which lies you want to own up to. He waited 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds of dead silence. I'll wait, Kennedy said softly. We have all day, and you have a lot of explaining to do. Omar sat frozen. Her attorneys were whispering urgently, but she seemed unable to respond. The weight of the contradictory evidence, all of it bearing her signature, all of it sworn under penalty of perjury, had finally broken through her carefully constructed defenses. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, watching her struggle. Then he pulled out one more document, his final piece of evidence, his closing argument. Ma'am, when you were sworn into Congress in January 2019, you placed your hand on a Quran and took an oath. Do you remember what that oath says? Omar's voice was barely audible. Yes. Let me refresh your memory. Kennedy pulled out a card with the oath printed on it. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter. He set down the card. Support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Did you mean those words, or was it just theater for the cameras? Omar's eyes flashed. How dare you question? How dare I? Kennedy's voice went sharp. Ma'am, I've spent the last 4 hours documenting how you've betrayed that oath. You've voted against American interests to benefit foreign powers. You've used campaign funds for personal expenses. You've committed perjury on federal documents. You've invoked anti-Semitic tropes that endangered Jewish Americans. You've minimized terrorism. You've lied, cheated, and stolen your way through 2 years in Congress. He stood, gathering his papers. So yes, I dare question whether you meant that oath, because your actions since taking it suggest you didn't. Kennedy pulled out a final analysis, this one showing Omar's voting record compared to every other member of Congress. I had my staff do a comprehensive analysis. They looked at every member's votes on legislation supporting American allies, American strategic interests, American security priorities. They created a metric for how often each member votes in alignment with American interests. He held up the chart. The average Democrat votes in alignment with American interests 78% of the time. The average Republican, 82%. The most dovish, most anti-interventionist members still vote in alignment with American interests at least 60% of the time. Kennedy pointed to a dot on the chart, far removed from all the others. That's you. 17% alignment. You vote against American interests more consistently than some members vote for them. In fact, there's only one other member of Congress with a lower alignment score, and he's been accused of being a foreign agent for China. He set down the chart. So let me ask you directly, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Who do you work for? Who do you serve? Because you're getting a paycheck from the United States government. You're supposed to represent the people of Minnesota's 5th District. You took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Kennedy leaned forward. But your votes benefit Turkey. Your statements benefit Iran. Your advocacy benefits Qatar. Your rhetoric endangers Jewish Americans. Your financial crimes enriched yourself and your boyfriend. So who are you working for, ma'am? Because it sure doesn't seem like America. The room erupted. Omar's attorneys were shouting objections. Gallery observers were on their feet. Committee members were calling for order. Through it all, Kennedy stood there, arms crossed, waiting. When the chaos finally died down, he spoke again, his voice cutting through the remaining murmur. I'm going to tell you what happens next. This committee is going to vote, probably unanimously, to refer your case to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. We're going to recommend immediate removal from all committee assignments. We're going to release every document, every piece of evidence, everything we've discussed today to the public. Kennedy picked up his folders, stacking them neatly. The U.S. Attorney for Minnesota is going to receive this case file. They're going to convene a grand jury. That grand jury is going to indict you on multiple counts. Federal prosecutors don't bring cases they don't think they can win, and ma'am, this case is a winner. You signed these documents. Your signature is right there. You swore they were true, and they contradict each other. He walked toward the door of the committee room, then turned back. You'll be convicted, probably on at least half the charges. You'll go to prison. Maybe 3 years, maybe 5, maybe more. You'll be released as a convicted felon, unable to vote, unable to hold office, unable to do much of anything except try to rebuild a life you destroyed through your own greed, corruption, and betrayal. Kennedy paused at the threshold. But here's what really gets me. You had everything. You came to America as a refugee. This country gave you safety, opportunity, education, a chance at a better life. You got elected to Congress, the most powerful legislative body in the world. You had a platform, influence, the ability to actually help people. His voice dropped, and you threw it all away. For what? Campaign money for your boyfriend, cozying up to foreign dictators. Was it worth it? The American dream gave you everything and you spat in its face. He shook his head. This hearing is adjourned. Representative Omar, you're dismissed. I'd say it's been a pleasure, but my mama raised me not to lie. The gavel came down, and with it, Ilhan Omar's political career effectively ended. The video went viral within hours. Not on mainstream media at first, they tried to downplay it, uncomfortable with the implications, uncertain how to cover such a comprehensive takedown. But on social media, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, everywhere people could share and comment and react, the Kennedy hearing spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, 50 million views. Within 48 hours, over 100 million. People who'd never watched C-SPAN in their lives were sharing clips, marveling at the preparation, the receipts, the absolute prosecutorial precision of Kennedy's questioning. Kennedy's receipts became a meme overnight. People started using it to describe any situation where someone came overprepared with documentation. Job interview. Better bring Kennedy's receipts. Argument with your spouse. She came with Kennedy's receipts. College essay. Professor showed up with Kennedy's receipts. The senator's office was flooded with fan mail. Actual fan mail for a congressional hearing. Letters thanking him for having the courage to ask the questions everyone wanted asked. Donations poured into his campaign fund from people across the country who'd never voted in Louisiana and never would. They just wanted to support someone willing to hold power accountable. Within 72 hours, the political consequences began. Nancy Pelosi, looking visibly uncomfortable at a press conference, announced that Omar would be stripped of her committee assignments pending the ethics investigation. She used careful language, talking about the seriousness of the allegations, the need for due process, but her meaning was clear. Omar was toxic now, and the Democratic leadership was cutting her loose. The House Ethics Committee moved with unusual speed. Within a week, they voted unanimously to recommend expulsion proceedings. Unanimously. Democrats and Republicans, progressives and moderates, everyone agreed that the evidence was too overwhelming, the violations too severe, to allow Omar to remain in Congress. Progressive Democrats who'd previously defended Omar suddenly discovered they had scheduling conflicts when reporters asked for comment. Statements of support that had been automatic after previous controversies were notably absent. The Squad, that group of progressive representatives who'd made their names challenging party leadership, went quiet. Even they couldn't find a way to defend the evidence Kennedy had presented. The Department of Justice moved fast too. Within 2 weeks, the U.S. Attorney for Minnesota announced the opening of multiple investigations into Omar's conduct: immigration fraud, campaign finance violations, tax fraud, perjury. Each investigation formal, each one serious, each one with the potential to send her to prison. The FBI started interviewing witnesses, neighbors who'd seen Omar and Elmi's living arrangements, campaign staff who'd worked on the payments to Minot's firm, foreign policy aides who'd arranged the meetings with Turkish and Qatari officials, bank employees who'd processed the suspicious financial transactions. The investigation was thorough, methodical, building a case brick by brick. Omar hired lawyers, multiple law firms actually, each one specializing in a different type of federal crime she was accused of. The legal bills were staggering, burning through her campaign funds at a rate that would have been impressive if it weren't so desperate. Her campaign committee sent out frantic fundraising emails, but donations had dried up. Nobody wanted to be associated with her anymore. Polling in Minnesota's 5th District told the story. Before the hearing, Omar's approval rating stood at 58%. 1 week after the hearing, 31%. 2 weeks after, 23%. 73% of voters in her own district wanted her to resign. 73% in a district that had elected her with 64% of the vote just months earlier. A primary challenger emerged within days. Anton Meltonmo, a moderate Democrat, attorney and mediator who explicitly ran on restoring integrity to the 5th District. His announcement speech didn't even mention Omar by name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew what he meant when he talked about the need for representatives who put constituents first, who followed the law, who honored their oaths of office. The money followed. Donors who'd supported Omar in previous cycles switched allegiances. Organizations that had endorsed her issued statements, reevaluating their support. Celebrities who'd campaigned for her developed sudden amnesia about ever having met her. The speed with which she became politically toxic was remarkable. International consequences followed too. Turkish officials who'd met with Omar 17 times suddenly couldn't recall her name. Diplomatic amnesia, the State Department called it privately, with more than a little satisfaction. Qatari representatives deleted photos from social media. Foreign lobbying organizations quietly removed her from their websites. Nobody wanted to be associated with an investigation into foreign agent violations. Tim Minnett's consulting firm collapsed within a month. The E Street Group, which had made millions from Omar's campaign, couldn't find a single client willing to hire them. The firm closed its offices, laid off its staff, and Minett himself disappeared from public view, his social media accounts deleted, his professional network dissolving overnight. But the real impact was on Omar's carefully constructed public image. She'd built her brand on being the brave refugee, the fighter taking on the establishment, the victim of discrimination and hatred who persevered anyway. That image had made her a progressive hero, a symbol of resistance, a fundraising powerhouse who could pack rally halls and generate headlines. Kennedy had destroyed that image with evidence, with documents bearing her signature, with her own contradictory sworn statements. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a criminal who'd been caught. She wasn't fighting the establishment. She was the establishment, corrupt and entitled and convinced she was above the law. The indictments came 3 months after the hearing. 18 federal counts. 5 counts of immigration, fraud related to her marriage to Elmi. 4 counts of perjury, related to false statements on federal tax returns. 3 counts of federal student loan fraud. 4 counts of campaign finance, fraud related to payments to Minett's firm. 2 counts of making false statements on financial disclosure forms. The Minnesota Attorney General added state charges the same day. More tax fraud, identity fraud, election law violations. The combined maximum sentence, if convicted on all counts, exceeded 50 years. Nobody thought she'd get anywhere near that, but even a fraction was serious prison time. Her attorneys filed every motion they could think of. Motion to dismiss for selective prosecution. Motion to dismiss for lack of evidence. Motion to suppress documents. Motion to sever charges. Motion for change of venue. Every single motion was denied. The evidence was too strong, the violations too clear, the case too airtight. Legal experts gave her about a 5% chance of acquittal on all counts. Most predicted conviction on at least half the charges, which meant serious federal prison time. Her attorneys started floating plea deal inquiries, feeling out whether prosecutors would be willing to reduce charges in exchange for a guilty plea. The Justice Department's response was essentially, "We have Kennedy's receipts. Make us an offer." They weren't interested in deals. They had a sitting member of Congress on video, under oath, unable to explain away contradictory documents she'd signed. This was the kind of case prosecutors dream about. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. In the meantime, Omar remained in office, technically, but she'd been stripped of all committee assignments, expelled from the Progressive Caucus, and isolated by her Democratic colleagues. She showed up to vote occasionally, walking through the Capitol hallways alone, ignored by everyone. It was political death by exile, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the formal expulsion vote. In Congress, her case became a cautionary tale almost immediately. Ethics training sessions started using Omar as an example of what not to do. "Don't be the next Ilhan Omar" became shorthand for "keep your corruption subtle." Young members of Congress, particularly those from diverse backgrounds, found themselves given extra scrutiny, extra pressure to be absolutely clean, All because Omar had burned down the trust that they'd worked so hard to build. But perhaps the most telling aftermath came 6 months later, in a moment that went viral all over again. Senator Kennedy was walking to his car after a long day of committee hearings. A reporter spotted him, ran over with a camera crew and shouted, "Senator, any comment on the Ilhan Omar trial?" Kennedy stopped, turned, and gave that small smile that everyone now recognized. "Ma'am," he said to the reporter, "I said everything I needed to say in that hearing. The evidence speaks for itself. That's the beauty of the truth. It doesn't need follow-up comments or spin or clarification. It just is." The reporter pressed, "But do you feel vindicated?" Kennedy shook his head. "I don't feel vindicated. I feel sad. Sad that someone who had every opportunity to serve with honor chose corruption instead. Sad that it took so long for anyone to hold her accountable. Sad that we have to have these hearings at all." He paused, then continued, "But I don't regret doing it. Corruption in Congress, regardless of party or politics, is a cancer. You cut it out or it spreads. You expose it to sunlight or it metastasizes. What we did in that hearing room wasn't political. It was necessary." He started to walk away, then turned back one more time. "Oh, and one more thing." That smile again. "Keep your receipts, folks. Always keep your receipts." The video of that exchange got another 10 million views. The phrase "Kennedy's receipts" evolved from a meme into a cultural touchstone, shorthand for thorough preparation and ironclad evidence. Ilhan Omar's trial began in March. The prosecution took 2 weeks to present their case, methodically walking the jury through every contradictory document, every false statement, every fraudulent transaction. The defense took 3 days, trying to argue that the contradictions were innocent mistakes, that the payments were legitimate, that everything had been taken out of context. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on 14 of 18 counts. Acquitted on 4 counts related to campaign finance fraud where the prosecution couldn't prove intent beyond reasonable doubt, but convicted on all the perjury charges, all the immigration fraud charges, all the tax fraud charges. Sentencing came 2 months later. The judge, a Clinton appointee whom nobody could accuse of political bias, was thorough and pointed in her remarks. She talked about the seriousness of lying under oath, of abusing the immigration system, of betraying public trust. She talked about how Omar's position as a member of Congress made her crimes more serious, not less, because she'd been held to higher standard and had failed spectacularly. The sentence, 4 years in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. Immediate surrender, no bail pending appeal, fines totaling $375,000, mandatory restitution of $84,000 in fraudulently obtained student loan money. Omar was taken into custody in the courtroom. The image of her being led away in handcuffs became the final iconic photo of her political career, broadcast on every news channel, shared millions of times on social media. The House of Representatives held its expulsion vote the following week. The vote was 346 to 78, well above the 2/3 majority required. 78 members, all progressive Democrats, voted against expulsion, citing due process and the right to appeal. Everyone else, Democrats and Republicans alike, voted to expel her. She became only the 6th member of Congress ever expelled from the House, and the first since 2002. Her name was stricken from the roll. Her office was cleaned out. Her staff was terminated. It was as if she'd never been there. In the aftermath, political scientists and historians tried to make sense of what had happened. How had someone with so many red flags, so many problems, so much obvious corruption made it so far? How had she won election to Congress, served 2 terms, built a national profile, all while committing crimes that should have been caught much earlier? The answers were uncomfortable. She'd been protected by identity politics, they said. Anyone who'd questioned her too aggressively had been called racist or Islamophobic, and so the questions hadn't been asked. She'd been shielded by progressive politics, with allies more interested in protecting one of their own than holding her accountable. She'd been enabled by a media ecosystem that treated her as a victim by default, never seriously investigating the allegations against her until it was too late.